Okay, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to the Annex Sociology podcast. My name is Joseph Cohen. I'm a professor of sociology at Queens College in the City University of New York. We have no guests today. We don't even really have a live audience today, but we thought we would maintain our weekly Tuesday appointment in case anybody wants to see us. And I got some great guests. Joining us today, first, regular viewers slash listeners will know Dan Morrison from Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. Good to see you again, Dan.
Good to be here, Joe. Always a pleasure.
And a special guest for today, my colleague at Queens College, Robin Rogers. Robin is currently working on a book about Generation X women, and she works with CUNY's high-performing students in the Honors College. And she's one of my go-to people on some of the topics we're going to be talking about today. So it's super to have you. Thanks for joining us, Robin. Oh, Robin, you're muted.
I was just saying, thank you, Joe. I want to have you introduce me for everything from now on.
That's introducing is one of my wheelhouse talents, I guess. Well, it's super to have you here. And today, so for those of you who join us after the fact, we're just getting together and having a little water cooler discussion on some news items that have caught our eye this week. And I wanted to start with I think the topic that everybody is talking about, or at least they should, GPT-3, those AI chatbots. Have you guys seen these chatbots? Have you seen discussion of them? Dan.
I have seen discussions of them. Yeah. I mean, where I hang out online, Twitter and increasingly Mastodon, there's been some discussion about, whether or not we ought to throw up our hands and embrace our AI bot overlords, or we should wring our hands and claim once again cry again about the death of the ability of our students to write anything coherently. And then I've seen some interesting pushback too. So Robin, have you seen some of that?
Yeah, I've seen very, very little of the discussion, although the discussion has crossed my screen, certainly. Part of the reason is probably I don't use Twitter. I have a Twitter account, but I don't use it. But it's interesting to me because I consider myself an academic / writer. So I consider my writer identity is not quite as strong as my academic identity. But I certainly see in my teaching and in my own work, writing to be essential. And so I'm curious about how this will all pan out and a little bit skeptical.
Yeah. Well, let me give you guys a super brief introduction, just to sort of set the stage for anybody who's watching this who hasn't heard about this. So earlier this semester, there's a nonprofit research consortium called OpenAI, which basically they create algorithms that scour media on the internet and database the words that are attached or the descriptors that are attached to all of this digital media. And basically they've developed models that have the computer guess what a picture would look like or what an essay would look like that is described by the words that the user inputs. So let me give you an example over here, all right? So this is DALL-E 2. This was the early AI item that was making waves earlier this semester. And you can see almost immediately how it represents a real threat to people who make art for a living. Like, take a look at this. I'm going, this is DALL-E, and I'm on the site, and I'm going to tell it to draw. I'm going to tell DALL-E to draw a building from Queens College campus in New York City on a rainy day with a unicorn in the foreground. Okay, you can make all sorts of interesting things. And so we'll let the computer start to generate. I didn't try this in advance, so we're sort of just doing this live without a net. But there you see, you get 3 reasonably photorealistic pictures. Now, these buildings don't exist in Queens College. What's interesting is these are not actual buildings. Those aren't pictures of anything. Those are computer-generated estimates of what a photo would look like that has those words attached to it. And that's really important because that means That building doesn't exist. Nobody took that picture, and so it's free. And the implications of it are everybody who's been hiring artists to do low-level graphics can now get these pictures done for like pennies each. And so, for example, in our podcast, we've just entirely started to make our show art dolly generated. I can't afford an artist. And it poses a real problem for people who are professional artists. Now, check this out. Recently, hold on, I'll try a little bit. Now, check this out. Recently, the algorithm has now released a text generating version. Watch this. Write a 1,000 word essay or a 1,000 word Marxist analysis of the World Cup. Okay. And I'll ask the computer to generate it. And it will almost generate, I mean, you probably can't read it here, but it is generating a brief essay, and it is extremely competent. Well, no, I wouldn't say extremely competent. It delivers that B level essay where there's like, it structurally looks like an essay and it's grammatically correct and it conveys basic facts with no innovation, no insight, none of that. Problem is that that's like my B students, right? I don't know if I can get your typical student to generate like an incisive, original Marxist critique of the World Cup or anything. And so I think we're really left at a loss here where like the computers are coming for those students who could only sort of produce or imitate, you know, the basic structure of a written argument, but couldn't really generate something new themselves. And I think it's a big concern. Like, how are we going to grade essays? Should we even be using essays? But more importantly, like, are these computers going for our B students? And what should we do about it? That's what's been on my mind. Dan, what have been your sort of takes on this?
Well, I just had a thought about, you're talking about the B student who can put together a well-formatted essay, few, no grammar mistakes, good spelling, that kind of thing. And it makes me think about, what are we really trying to assess when we assign essays?
Yeah.
And how are we scaffolding the skills that students need to write a really creative, interesting, compelling Marxist analysis of the World Cup or anything?
Right.
Right. And then if our rubrics or our assessment criteria are weighted towards like maybe these more superficial things, then first of all, we probably should rethink that.
Yeah.
Right. And because that's not really what I think most of us are actually genuinely after, even though those are the things that are kind of the easiest to assess.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I have classes, I probably don't teach as many students as the two of you do on average, but if I've got a class of 50, 60 students, and they're all turning in 1,000, 1,500 word essays, some moments I'm tempted to grade more on things like, how well is this formatted? Or, am I annoyed by the spelling and grammar mistakes? And then not thinking as critically about the actual kind of content. So that's one thing. But what I really wanted to say is that some folks have, as I was saying earlier, it's kind of thought that the sky is falling on our ability to help students write coherently and well. Someone on Twitter, and I so apologize to whomever this was, said, well, let's kind of turn this around. I'm paraphrasing. And they said, well, look, what if you had in class the AI system generate an essay, and then you had groups of students analyze that essay for exactly these kinds of things that you're talking about? What is the argument here? Does it make sense? What are the sources? Let's track down those sources. How would you edit this essay to make it better? Examples are good, right? But examples that are just copied and pasted are bad. So how can we use these as like step ups, or as sort of exemplars of maybe some pitfalls to avoid without throwing away the essay form entirely?
Robin, what about you? AI essays.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have two very distinct thoughts, and I don't think they contradict each other, but one is definitely from the professor aspect of me, and the other from the writer aspect. As a professor, I worry that students will use this, and we probably will not lose any great writing over it. But what we will lose is the dialogue that ideally you're teaching students to have with themselves. I talk to my students about thinking on the paper, and that they're able to think more broadly, I believe, when they write and respond to their own writing than they can in their own head. And so there's a quote, and I wish I could remember who said it, but I like it. It's, how do I know what I think until I've heard myself say it?
Mm.
And I feel like that's the case with writing and thinking. And I often will have my students write just, 5 minutes of free writing at the end of class, just to really condense what they've learned. So that concerns me. As a writer, I have to kind of check my ego at the door. That there's no competition here. That no one's going to observe social interactions the way that Fitzgerald did, right? In AI, that's not happening. So we may lose a whole chunk of hack writers.
Yeah.
But I don't think we'll lose good writers, but we may end up with students who don't learn to hear themselves think.
I'll tell you what my concern is. It is absolutely not a threat to the A student, right? It's not a threat. You can tell the writing's bland, it's non-specific, it's rote. I mean, it's really just a milquetoast generic essay. But some people, let me share some takes on Twitter that captured my sentiment pretty well. Hold on, let me just get this up here because it resonated with me. Some of these. Okay, hold on. So here's one. The reason so this is Stephen White on Twitter. The reason the AI thing looks like a challenge for student essays is that there's a common style of writing that I assume students learn in good high schools that looks more or less right in a structural sense, but doesn't necessarily say much. And that's often what will get students a B+. And then John Warner writes, GPT-3 is a bullshitter. It has no idea what it's saying. It understands syntax, but not context. It's not thinking in the way that humans think when they write, but lots of students have learned to get good grades by becoming proficient bullshitters, by mimicking the form of what we want rather than the context of what we want. And so I think that there are a lot of students who we teach who they're not that deep into Soc. They didn't drink deeply when they read that article or that book. It's all triage. And that's a chunk of decent students who pull that off. I don't know what to do with those students and below, because some of these essays actually look better than my C student essays. At least they're coherent or, well written. So I think part of it is the threat will never be to the good students. It will be to the students who they don't want to be there. They're not deep into it. They're just trying to get it done. And that's for me, 80% of my students. And so I don't know what to do with them. Any thoughts on that take, or am I off?
Yeah, no, Joe, I was just thinking part of the problem could be that if you get an essay written by GP3 or whatever it's called, and you already have the sense that the student is one of these, quite frankly, modal students, kind of in the middle of the distribution, then it might be easy to not look a little bit deeper at that, because one of the points anyway of assigning writing essays is actually to identify people who need that kind of extra help, right? And so if this becomes something that kind of middle of the distribution student uses and then just turns in as their own, because it's not going to be caught by turning it in, right? Yeah. Most likely. Not that I advocate for that anyway. Yeah. But you're going to miss some of those folks who could be, could be remedied, right? Could be helped by a little bit of extra attention and just catching something that says, hey, this is not that this is not your work. I mean, obviously it's not your work, but that's beside the point. The point is we're not catching the people who we need to be bringing along,
right?
And who could develop a more genuine interest in our topics.
Robin?
Yeah, I think one of the solutions to that is unfortunately hard to do for two reasons that I'll get to. But I think it's the drafts, right? It's the revise. Because frankly, I don't care if a poor student hands in an AI generated essay. If I can say to them, okay, wait a minute, which arguments make sense, which arguments don't, and then they have to actually revise it according to my standards. That might actually be a helpful prompt, right? But the problems with that are twofold. One is that we are facing situations at the college level where we have fewer and fewer resources, and that's just going to get worse. And honestly, while I don't think our students are worse, I'm not an advocate of the every generation is worse than the last theory of life. But I do think that they are far less willing to do things like multiple drafts. They find that onerous. I used to, in my 101 class, assign 5 written assignments. If I assigned 5 written assignments today to a 101 class, there would be a revolution. So I think if we could have this be something that students work with rather than their final draft, it could actually be useful.
So what are your plans for the fall then? Are you like, what's your, are your classes going to change at all in the spring or next fall? Like what's your take on what you're going to do? Go for Robin. Yeah, go for Robin. Sorry.
Right. So I did an experiment this semester that worked pretty well and is quite controversial. I assigned no readings in my deviance class. I assigned 71 videos, and each week was about 2 hours worth of videos, and there were quizzes on the contents of the videos. And more or less, I didn't want to fight post-pandemic students on reading, but I wanted them to get the content, and it worked. It worked beautifully. Now, I will not do that with all of my classes. I will certainly not do that with upper level classes, but I could see something like this being a sort of analogous, because you're simply taking the reality of what there is in the world right now and figuring out how to get that content or those skills across to your students in the environment you actually have.
Dan, how about you? Any plans?
Yeah, this fall I'm teaching fewer classes than normal for various reasons, but some of that writing happens in class. So I have them have a notebook that's like their class notebook, like those composition books from way back in the day, and they just write on prompts in class. And then if there are exercises or things that I want them to do, like I call them active learning exercises, the computer will not help you with that. Like they can't tell you, what it's like to go to the Brown Library Starbucks and observe gendered interactions or raced interactions. Maybe they could do something general about that. I did think for any essays that I have folks do, I think putting the prompt in the AI, having it generate 1,000, 1,500 words, and then handing that out to the students and saying, okay, this is what an AI generated essay looks like. What is good about this? What's not good about it? What would you update? What would you change? Why is it not good? What do you like about it or not like about it as a reader? How does it seem fake? Is a good object lesson in the kinds of skills we want them to develop as readers and as writers. Why does this not work? It's not evocative enough. It's not crisp enough. It doesn't set the scene well enough to really help me picture what I'm supposed to be getting from this story.
Joe, can I just jump in here? I think that the greater threat to student writing is not this technology. I think it is the persuasive essay. Which I tell my students in every single class I teach. They taught you to write a persuasive essay in high school, and they were wrong. Do not, under any circumstances, give me an overblown opinion that you don't actually believe in, right? Because that means one of two things: either you're stupid or you think I'm stupid, and neither one of those things is true. So you need to be intellectually honest and show both sides. And the students as a whole, actually, even though that's a bit harsh, react really well to that, because they knew they were writing nonsense, but they were getting rewarded for it. And to come along and have somebody say, no, tell me what you really think, they tend to be okay about. So, I think in some ways this is the least of our problems. The push in K through 12 education to there is one answer to every question, and every essay should be persuasive and one-sided. These are our bigger obstacles.
So the two things that, or one thing that each of you said resonates with me a lot. For Dan, one of your tactics is something that I've done in my research methods class, which is that the report writing is written for concrete people in the local community. I have students just go out and run survey research projects for like local businesses or nonprofits or stuff. And that way GPT can't write to the specifics of it. And also GPT is very vague on citations, and it's not in direct conversation with concrete works. And that's one of the big deficiencies. The one thing that I'm picking up off of Robin, which I do like, is this concept of writing as really getting the students to be true to their own view and using writing as a transmission to transmit, their subjective views on things or clear out their reasoning. That was quite clever, and I hadn't thought of that. The other one is a statistics class, and I will say this to any of you who are teaching statistics or learning statistics: GPT-3 it doesn't just give amazing coding tutorials, it will write code for you. And that is, and which is very, very interesting. And it can go very, very difficult. It can get to quite an advanced level. Like I was asking GPT how to analyze like complex survey designs in R, like with replicate weights and strata and stuff like that. The advice it gave me was completely on point. It was really wonderful. So I think my strategy is for my graduate statistics students, I'm going to tell them to use GPT. So like sorry. My bad. I apologize for that. I'm going to tell my students to use GPT. That's my plan. So, all right. Well, should we move on? Any other final words on GPT, or should we move on to the next topic, Dan?
Well, I just think, first of all, teaching is difficult.
Yeah.
And this intersects with all kinds of trends that are really, really bad for high quality teaching and sustainable teaching. And so, I totally agree with multiple drafts and, and consistent feedback. And, that is a thing that is much less likely given the kind of economics and that have been forced on us in terms of who teaches the classes and how academic work is actually done, or teaching labor is actually done. And actually, this is a good segue to, I think, our point about academic piecework. Joe, do you want to talk about that?
You want to do that one? All right, yeah, let's do that one. So I saw a tweet by JP Pardo Guerra, friend of the show. He's always great for opinions. I love following him. So JP put out this tweet. Says the other thing that so he's quote tweeting this woman who appears to be starting like a PR business for academics, right? And she writes, the original tweet was, I was invited to do a talk recently that would have helped a lot of people. They told me they could only pay me $500, and then I went live just yesterday to talk about how academics should charge a minimum of $1,300 a talk. We shouldn't be speaking to the public for less than $3,000. And JP didn't like this. He was right. JP wrote in response, the other thing that causes me discomfort about these kinds of merit-minded forms of individualization of rewards is that thousands of colleagues spend hundreds of hours in a year in the classroom to make way less. And it tacitly devalues teaching. More generally, I think that there is there's just this mentality, I think, that is prevalent, where scholars just are saying, listen, I'm in a business, I teach classes, I write my book, and anything else that you want me to do, I need to get paid for it. And there are definitely some logics to it, right? You don't want to be exploiting junior people, for example, or adjuncts or things like that. On the other hand, when it comes out of the mouth of like a full professor who's, coming up on 200 grand and is earning at like the 97th percentile for like a job that requires them to be there, a dozen hours a week, 6 months a year, I don't know if the look is good. And so what are your takes? Like, where's the line between we should just do stuff because it's our job and we should be asking for money? Robin, do you want to start us off on this one?
Sure. I have actually forgive me, a gender take on this. I would be really curious to see the breakdown, it's a little different when you're talking about invited talks, but when you're talking about things like, committee work or running a program over a summer or something along those lines, when I was coming up, I was in a program for, young professional academic women, and we were told straight out, ask for double what they offer you, because then you might earn about what your male colleagues earn. And so I wonder if some of this pushback is coming out of that tradition, which is not so much taught anymore, although we're still earning less than our male colleagues. On the other hand, I do believe that being a professor is a job that encompasses more than teaching your classes and writing your books and papers. There is I think, ideally a public intellectual aspect to it. I think there are, service aspects to it. And I don't necessarily think those need to be paid for separately. So I have a mixed view on it.
Dan?
Well, I'm glad that, Robin, you brought up the gender aspect. Obviously, there's like a intersectional race and gender aspect here. At many places, there are just so few faculty of color and women faculty of color, particularly. And there are student groups, there are organizations, there are folks who want to give talks. There are a bunch of service responsibilities that those folks get requests for. And I mean, I have a few colleagues like that here at ACU. When we talk about this, they say that it is difficult to turn those opportunities down because they are one of so few on the campus. For those of us with relative privilege, I think it is part of our jobs to balance. I was always told teaching, research, and service. The weights of those are different, right? Obviously someone who is teaching at, Princeton or Michigan will have a different mix of those things than I will here at this small liberal arts college in Texas. And that's, that may not be what everybody who graduates with a PhD wants. Maybe lots of people want Michigan over ACU, but people have different preferences. And also the job market is not equitable in terms of what people want. So, I do think academics have a responsibility. People with faculty roles, particularly full-time tenure track and tenured faculty roles, especially tenured folks at the associate and full level, have a responsibility to do more service than many are doing right now. And especially at those places where junior folks and women of color, other minority groups have a disproportionate share of those responsibilities. I also think, I get to do this podcast, which, do I get a check for it? No, dear listeners, dear viewers.
It's a money losing operation.
Yeah, totally. But think about it this way: the whole university is a cross subsidy game. I mean, the whole university is. So, we do things because we value them. We don't always do them because we get paid in a special line for them. I really think that, folks who are at the associate and tenured level, associate level who are tenured, full who are tenured, and make, that 200K or more, whatever a decent living is for wherever you are, like maybe don't take, maybe just advocate for opportunities where you don't just say, yeah, I need an extra $500 for that or an extra $1,000 for that.
I like, first of all, 200K, just so we're clear, that is not CUNY money. No one.
That's clear.
But I'll tell you, there were two data points that have crossed my eyes since I became a senior professor that have affected me. One of them was when I learned that our department costs millions of dollars to operate annually, and those millions are on faculty salary. And mostly faculty salary. And it's like, people always complain that there's not enough resources, but it's like, we're the resources, like we're the investment. And I remember when I did my finance book, and it's like, yeah, okay, we're not rich, and we all have a friend who's earning 150% of what we earn or whatever. But these are all amazing jobs, like with really just, unparalleled benefits, like and security and things like that. And so like for me, I feel like it's a really good job and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm like, the state of New York is spending I feel a lot of cash on, on me. And so I sort of feel like a little bit of an obligation to like make sure that like the department works well. I don't know. Am I off here? Am I like?
I want to push back on that a little because
right.
maybe this is because I was born and raised in New York.
Yeah.
But about 5 years ago, I was walking with a friend of mine who works in finance. And I said to him, oh, yeah, well, you make 10 times what I make. And he laughed out loud. He said, Robin, I make way more than 10 times what you make. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think when you look at in New York and at CUNY, and it may not be true everywhere else, what we are paid given our skills and credentials is low. Yeah. Now, I'm not complaining about it because it's a good living. It's and it's a great job. But I think, I think the stronger argument is that we made a choice to take a modest but decent wage in return for giving back to the society. And what we get in return for that is meaningful work and a lot of, nice tasks to do. Yeah. Teaching is enjoyable. Writing is enjoyable. Not always, but far more
to us.
Often, yeah, far more often than I think most people find their jobs enjoyable. So I guess I'm balking at the idea that we're already paid for it, but I'm generally agreeing that I think it is a part of the overall role of the professor.
You know what else I've thought about a lot recently, especially when I talk with younger people. When I was a junior, there was a lot of sociology should, and the department should, and I wish somebody would do all this. And now it's like dawned upon me that like, we're in leadership in like a top 20, like that is us, it's like if senior faculty, like nothing will happen that we don't personally make happen. And if we're going to stand pat and say, listen, I'm not moving unless anybody gives me money. I don't know. It will not strengthen the discipline. That's for sure. And it won't safeguard our long-term positions. Any final words on this one, Dan?
I just think in part I think we're compensated in control.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of how we allocate our time resources and in some of that flexibility that is maybe less available to many of the colleagues we've already gestured towards earlier in the conversation. But yeah, that's what makes it such a great occupation in a lot of ways, is the ability to say, yes, I will sponsor this student organization. No, I will not sponsor that student organization. Yeah. Like just the idea that you have that level of control in like this society, which to me is like so obsessed, unhealthily obsessed with productivity and you sort of corporate dictates in a lot of ways, is a bit of built-in rebellion into that kind of speed up system. And so I would advocate for the work to be spread more equitably and certainly more up the line than sort of down the line, so to speak. But yeah, I tell people it's a good job, and I recognize I have a lot of advantages as well.
Robin, you had last word?
Can I add one more thing? I think when you're talking about giving public talks or writing an essay for which you're either not compensated or I often get $200. I think it's important to include the value to the individual of having their voice heard. We live in a society, my very well compensated friend in finance can't say very much, or he will lose his very well compensated job. I, as has been shown occasionally, can say very much, and I don't lose my modestly compensated job. So, you have to take the value of really having access to free speech and a pulpit at that.
Wow, I remember that during the Trump administration, especially. Like I remember people being like, "Yeah, we can't say a word online," and you realized it was like a really big job benefit to be opinionated
at a public school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah. It was like it's there's a lot of privilege. All right, cool. Well, Dan, do you want to move on to your banter topic?
Yeah, well, I have been reading and just finished last night a new book published in this year, 2022, by Frank Dobbin and Alexandria Kalev.
Caleb.
Caleb. Thank you, Joe. It's called.
Introduced me to my wife, by the way. Sandra did. Yeah.
This is definitely good. It's a small sociology world, right?
Yeah.
And the book is called Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't. And I just wanted to say a couple words about it because for not only the content, but also the style. So first on content, here's a book that has a really clear outcome, which is great. What proportion of management jobs in corporate America, I think they looked at over 8 million employees, are held by white men, white women, black men, black women, and so on in United States companies. So really crisp outcome, right? Does it go up or does it go down? And then does it go up or down in association with various efforts to diversify workforces? So in many companies and also in academia, we have workforces, faculties and staffs, managers that do not reflect either the demographics of the larger society or the demographics of the place in which the company is located and so forth. So, white men like me disproportionately represented in management ranks, and women of color, Latinx men, black men and so forth, dramatically underrepresented. So they go through a variety of efforts that have been made to increase the diversity of management ranks. What they find is that the things that most companies reach for don't work and are more about satisfying legal requirements and providing cover for HR departments and the associated institutions in comparison to like actually moving the needle on management positions, which I don't think is a terrible surprise to many people who are going to be listening to this or watching it. But what's super interesting is what they do find that works. So one of the things that works if you are going to do some kind of training is actually enlisting managers as allies and not blaming them for the lack of diversity on their teams or in their workplace. So saying to managers, you are biased and you are racist or sexist or classist or whatever is not a great strategy for getting those people on board, especially if they're white men. So that idea sort of partakes in this very common trope we have in our society of like attitudes lead to behaviors, right? Yeah. And that's really not always the case. In fact, it's usually not often the case. It's usually behaviors leading to attitudes, right? And so they have a very sociological take on what works. Classic, like all port contact theory kind of stuff, cross training on roles, mentoring programs, identity-based resource groups that help with recruitment of diverse populations for trainee and entry-level positions, internships for people of color, men and women of color, and so forth. So that's the content. The style is what I want to talk about. So this is written like an airport book.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
And I don't, now airport books kind of have a bad rep, but in this, what I mean is like a book you'd pick up at LAX if you're flying to New York. Right. So a book that you could potentially finish in like maybe 3.5, 4 hours if you just tried. So, short chapters, very to the point. Let me show you all the most complicated, complex graphic in the whole book. It's a bar chart. There are race and gender categories across the bottom, and this is percent change in management. This is the most complex one. That's what I mean by airport book. Not that, and this is not a critique. So Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Caleb, don't come after Caleb, don't come after me. That's a compliment because this book needs to be in the hands of people who take long flights on American Airlines.
Right.
Right. Who are going to a management seminar or going to a training session or going to a recruitment event. And so what I really want to know, I'll get to in a second, but what do you have to say?
No, I just wanted to ask you, like, is the writing, it's sort of like you're saying that it reaches out with our ideas and really makes them accessible to the decision makers who we're trying to influence.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I can see this being written by or being read by, someone who's like a junior vice president, and not just in HR, but in engineering or in logistics or in design, and being able to go through it and being able to tell really clearly what the results are on this massive data set that they got from the federal government. They had to de-identify it, obviously, but like, they also did interviews with managers and trainees and other people. It's really a very rich book written in an incredibly accessible way that, I think gives some really great ideas that aren't necessarily under the banner of diversity. Just good management practices that democratize the workplace, that are responsive to work-family balance issues, and that, work for everyone regardless of your race or gender, nationality, that kind of disability, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I immediately think of the saying, I'm full of sayings, easy reading is hard writing. I never respect a book more than when I can read it, I tell my students, write so that the reader has a donut in one hand and a cup of coffee on the other, and the book is balanced on their lap and they're on the train, and if you can get your ideas across then you're writing really well. So, I want to read this book. I haven't read this book for both style and content. I also think that this is where we're going as academic books die. I've been advised by numerous people to write the book I'm working on right now in that style. And I'm not philosophically against it. It's just been a difficult balance. But I think if you can take complex, serious ideas and convey them in an accessible way, then bravo. That's what we should be doing.
Although that has always been a central goal of mine in writing. And both the books that I've written always received the backhanded compliment of like, lays out the introductory groundwork well, or something like that. Because I sometimes feel like when the ideas come too easily, people mistake them for elementary or basic ideas. On the other hand, those people who are asking for you to write a 1,000 word page continental writing style tome, I don't really feel like they have any sense of what would actually sell or even be read in this discipline. Like I sometimes sense that like people aren't even reading in the discipline. So we're going to have to do.
But you're right. I mean, John Scrutiny, who's a great sociologist and a former mentor of mine, pulled me aside when I was in grad school, and he said, Robin, I really like your work, but you got to start throwing in some bigger words because, you're making it look easy and people aren't going to take you seriously. And he was only sort of joking because I'm a great fan of the shortest possible sentence with the, fewest possible words. Well, I guess that's redundant, but anyway. So I'm happy, I guess, to see such smart, and I know them only by reputation. They didn't arrange my marriage. But I'm happy to see such esteemed scholars write clearly. I think that's wonderful.
Well, it does lead me to my question, maybe for the audience and folks who are watching this later, if you want to maybe comment or send the show a tweet. Or a toot, I guess is what they're calling it on Mastodon.
Yeah.
Not quite sure about toot, actually. But anyway, I do some work on my campus with diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging stuff, whatever we're calling that these days. And Abilene Christian University, it's fair to say, is a historically white college, has been for a long time, founded in 1906. But we have a lot of white faculty and an increasingly diversifying student population. So what, for those who are listening, or maybe you too, what education or training or policies or practices have you seen work in that kind of context to ensure that we're providing this increasingly diverse student population with an education that's responsive to their concerns, that fits kind of their needs?
Robin, you want to go first?
Sure. Two things come to mind. One I mentioned earlier when we were off air. I am prone to dresses by nature. And I have chosen, in the last 10 years to wear them almost exclusively when I lecture, in order to convey the idea that I can be traditionally feminine and command the class with no problem. And I have students come up to me frequently and sort of whisper to me, can I be a feminist and a mother? And I say, yes. And, and they'll even come up to me and say, the girls, almost exclusively the young women, will say, you always wear dresses. And it's like, it's such a loaded comment. They're kind of like, does that mean I can? Or do I have to sort of, I think they're still struggling with what I struggled with in the 90s, which was, do I have to put on a really ugly power suit to be taken seriously?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's still a question. So representation matters, and I'm talking about in gender, but it obviously matters in race and ethnicity and social class. I also think this tendency, or this, what I'm calling a tendency, but this book, which is written in plain English, is a wonderful thing for inclusivity, because a lot of times you get students from, working class backgrounds who may not have the vocabulary, although they certainly have the intellectual capacity. And a book like that is accessible to them in a way that one written more obliquely might not be. And then I think the final thing is and this I think is controversial. I wonder what you two think about this.
Hmm.
I don't love the idea of tailoring curricula to different student bodies, with the exception of making sure that it is accessible in terms of reading level, writing ability, etc., but not content. So I am very much in favor of very broad, inclusive curricula, but that is taught across groups, so that we're not getting different information taught at primarily working class minority schools than we have at elite white schools. That worries me about the fragmentation of the culture.
Interesting. For me, I mean, we teach, Robin and I teach at a majority female, majority person of color school with a substantial immigrant population. And for someone like me, what am I going to teach people about race? They tell me what it's like. What I do, I feel like our students receive a lot of messages that foreground the fact that, they are not in the majority, or that these things happen. And I know my limits. And for me, I train them all to get jobs. I train them to write good, to run surveys. I teach them to code. And most of my energy is spent telling them that they can get good jobs, and if they just focus on skills. And it's just a role that I decided to assume in the programs that I operate, and given who I am. What am I going to teach? I don't know. I don't know about race. I don't know about gender. These aren't my areas of expertise, and I'm sure they could tell me about them. There's more for me to learn than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, I'll just be quick. I absolutely ask my students for examples from I teach a lot of deviance and criminology. And a lot of a good number of students every year have been in gangs or have families that are incarcerated. And, we take their lived experience in, and I say, if what I'm teaching you doesn't speak to what you're seeing in the world, then tell me, because then I'm not doing my job right. So I think, you can incorporate people's lives and respect their experience without saying, oh, this book is for this type of student and this book is for that type of student. That's the level that makes me nervous, not the inclusion of people's experiences. And then the one other thing that I do that I would not do, I don't think, at a primarily white school, elite white school, let me clarify. If I see a student who I think is very bright, I make a point at some point over the semester of locking eyes with them and saying, do you know you're really talented?
Mhm.
And sometimes that continues into a discussion and they join the honors program or whatever. But even if it doesn't, it's that teacher saying, you personally.
I'll tell you, Robin, tell me if you see this with our students, though. I feel like they are told that they are different so often that they start to assume that the stuff for white people isn't for them. Like the
That's
meta
exactly.
message, I feel our kids are told they're different so often that they don't even go for things. Like they don't even go for things that they are competitors for. They just assume it's for a different world almost. And I feel like sometimes you almost have to pull back on that when it's just so strong in the environment, so that students realize that they're all playing the same game and that they're all involved. Like in some ways, everybody is the same in a way, or we're all in the same contest. So don't just count yourself out or put yourself in a bubble. Try to get the good things. Try to get the famous things.
Yeah.
I think this connects to a lesson from this book. So I'm glad you mentioned this, Joe and Robin. The solutions or the suggestions that they have are programs for absolutely everybody in the company, right? So the mentoring programs are offered to everybody. The work-life balance stuff is offered to everybody. The cross-training is offered to everybody. And what they intentionally do is go out and say, this is for people who are, it was for everyone in the company, but we're going to make special efforts to reach out to our Black employees and our Asian American employees and our Latinx employees and our Black women employees. And so I don't mean to indicate that with my question that I was thinking about like separate curricula for separate
No.
groups, but I more like how have people had thoughts about sort of changing the sort of the ideal student. So there's the ideal worker norm, right? But there's also an ideal student norm, right? So Robin, your example of looking at that student who might not get that attention in class and saying, hey, you're actually really good at this. And I need you to know that I see you as a person and I recognize the value of what you bring to this class. I mean, that's a message that I personally try to send as much as possible. And I fear that many times colleagues in places like mine have that ideal student norm in their head. And it's hard to break out of that and see the many ways that students can meet learning outcomes. They can excel in the classroom, even if they're facing, we have students who work 2 jobs, right? We have students who have trouble getting enough nutrition. We have students who are insecurely housed. All those things run against that ideal student norm. And if we're not intentionally like making affirmative efforts to see those students in the way you're talking about, Robin, we're going to miss out on some skills and some capacities and to develop students who are going to be, real contributors, right, in their workplaces, like Joe is saying.
And I think I have intentionally trained myself to look at certain attributes that are usually attributed to poor students as indicators of potentially very good students. If I have a student who comes to class and is routinely maybe the hygiene's a little off, clothing is ratty, whatever else, or another student who's always falling asleep in class, my first thought sometimes can be annoyed if they're falling asleep. But my second thought is, I wonder if they have a job. I wonder if they have a kid. I wonder if they're that much more committed to being here, that they're showing up even after they've worked a shift and taken care of their kid. And so I just try to take some of those cues that we sometimes perhaps misread and leave open a possibility that that's a student I want to look at and see if there's a spark there.
I have one story. We're getting near the end of our length, but I have one story that I was saving because I, in fact, have a personal connection to that book. I went to graduate school. Frank Dobbin was on my my generals committee, and he taught me organizations. And Sandra is a dear friend of mine who I was just getting to know when I first went to Princeton, and my first research assistant job was on that project. And we were supposed to do interviews of HR managers. And my first day was September 11th, 2001.
Good timing, Joe.
And we were like, and I remember we were scheduled to start, and there was like a bunch of hubbub. And I was like, Sandra, there's been a terrorist attack. She's like, oh, that's really a shame. All right, let's get ready for the thing, because like she's Israeli. So it's like, the world doesn't stop for a terrorist attack. And I remember going, listen, Sandra, I don't think people are going to be answering your survey today. This is like a really big one, I think. She was like, oh, then she switched on the TV. But it was just really funny because, it was like such an earth shattering event. And that's it's a very memorable day. I'll remember it forever. I will say, though, both Sandra and Frank are amazing sociologists. They're such good sociologists. And I like this idea of writing airplane books. Like, the truth is nobody wants to read our 1,000 page stuff. Like, no one wants to read our stuff. And and it's like, what good is this stuff if nobody reads it? Like, we're getting to the point where I often question what percentage of the actual discipline is reading this stuff, or anything for that matter. Like, we got a problem and we have to improve our communication. So as far as I'm concerned, like, they're doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is, removing barriers.
Definitely not a dig. And so that's Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. And Robin, I think you're exactly right. Writing in an accessible way is way more difficult than it is to obscure our ideas with fancy prose and references to whomever the theorist du jour is. And I grew up in the when Foucault was the kind of the hottest person going, and then kind of, or close in my view, by Bourdieu for a while. And I don't know how people feel about where we are now. I don't know if there's a great man in sociology in terms of sociological theory at the moment, but as I hope this book gets into a lot of managers' hands and a lot of decision makers' hands, and some of the basic lessons of sociology get imparted to these folks, which I think this is a great book to drive home some of those really fundamental ideas.
This was recently, maybe a few years ago, after I had started the podcast, I was reading Bourdieu for the podcast book that I'm writing. And I was just so annoyed that I thought what I would do is I would record an episode where I read out loud chapter 1 of Theory of Cultural Production. And like, honest to God, it took hours and it was just so painful that I was like, I don't need to make this point that badly. I was like, I'm not reading this thing out loud. It took forever. But like, we all got PhDs here. And if all three of us sit with a book and read like some passages and are like, what's he saying? Like, how high does the bar have to be if not like our one PhDs in the field? Then what is it going to take? So,
one of my big pieces of advice to students writing is to read their work out loud. And I tell them, for one, you'll stumble over things and see when ideas are missing. But for another, if that voice doesn't sound at least related to your own speaking voice, try to bring your own speaking voice back. Of course, it's going to be more formal. They're not identical, but they should be related.
All right, we're going to have to end with that. Thank you very much, Daniel Morrison, Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. Always a pleasure, sir.
Good to be with you, Joe.
And Robin Rogers, thank you so much for joining us. Robin, I always love these podcasts when we record them. So thank you very much.
Always fun.
All right. You've been listening to the Annex, a sociology podcast. We are on the web, theannexpodcast.com. The Annex is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. To learn more, visit queenspodcastlab.org. On behalf of my co-host, Daniel Morrison from Abilene Christian University and Robin Rogers from Queen's College in the City University of New York, I'm Joe Cohen. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Robin.